Federal Fag and Alex Reynolds Mystery Series Book 2. Author Fred Hunter. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York, 1998. Narrator Eric Ost. For Raymond Dragon. Chapter 16. Peter was all for waiting until the next morning to do this, seeing as how our day had already been pretty full, to say the least. But I was too pumped to wait. I just want to check it out, I explained lamely. We got on the Santa Monica freeway and headed east. The endless LA rush hour was taking its toll. Traffic moved at a snail's pace when it moved at all. We exited at Alameda as per the conserje's instructions and headed north. This area was much more congested than Santa Monica, and it was definitely dustier and hotter. Being further from the ocean, I saw at once why our intention to come to this neighborhood caused such a stir with the conserje. From what we could see from Alameda, the side streets were peppered with huge lumbering buildings, and even with all the traffic, you got the impression of general desolation. Given the number of cars flowing out of the side streets, anyone with a brain was scattering from the area like half-drowned fleas from a dog that had just jumped in the river. About half a mile or so up Alameda, we found Workman Street, and I hung a right. God, can't the mob afford a better neighborhood? Said Peter, his forehead wrinkling with concern. This can't be the right place. Just before the street was cut off by the river, we found the address we were looking for. I circled around and parked about half a block down. The place was an enormous, rambling box of a building made of what looked to me like post-World War II corrugated tin. There were barred windows along the side, very high off the ground, that would prevent any improbable passers-by from looking in. The whole building looked like it would fold up like a beer can at the first tremor, though given its conspicuous age, it must have withstood far more than that. It had taken us so long to get to the building that it was now well after 7 and the area was deserted. That can't be it, said Peter. But it is. Look at the sign. Above one of the doors was a small wooden plaque that bore the words, Admiral General Distributors. That's a warehouse, I said stupidly. Your grasp of the obvious is astounding. We sat staring at the building for a moment. Then, as if impatient to get me away from the area before I did anything stupid, Peter said, Well, we've seen it. I ignored him. I wonder. What? Said Peter. Well, you remember what Jeff Durkin said at the party. Peter heaved a sigh. He said a lot, and he was high. No, I mean, when I asked him about where they filmed, he said they filmed at Holmes's house, and that he thought Holmes had a warehouse someplace too. Peter looked at the building, then back at me. So, it's just that it didn't occur to me at the time, but he mentioned the warehouse when I asked about where they filmed. I think he meant that they also filmed in a warehouse. Peter thought about this. Well, that could be, sure, but that doesn't mean it's this one, and what difference would it make anyway? I don't know. Maybe none at all, but I suppose if you really want to investigate the mob, the best thing to do would be to get them to let you use their faculties. I mean, then you could search the place when they weren't there. Peter shrugged. Well, either way, I can't believe Marino works in there. I was staring at the building. A new idea was growing in my mind. There were a couple of cars around, but nothing outstanding and nothing that looked as if it were specifically there for that particular warehouse. As idiotic as that sounds, it's the way I was thinking at that moment. Alex, did you hear me? Huh? Oh, yeah, but I don't want to waste the trip. I have an idea. I don't think I'm going to like it. I'm sure you're not going to like it. I think we should go in and have a look around. Are you fucking nuts? Said Peter with an uncharacteristic lapse in language. You want to break into a warehouse owned by the mob? Well, for crying out loud, we've already broken into the house of a man we thought was connected with the mob. But he wasn't. But we didn't know that at the time. We looked at each other for a minute. Peter clearly did not like the idea of doing this, but his expression told me that he was pretty sure I'd do it on my own, and in this, he was mistaken. I don't think I would have gone in there without him. All right, he said as he reached for the handle of the passenger door. But I want to go on record as saying I'm doing this under protest. Oh, you'll love breaking and entering, I said with a wave of my hand. Mother and I do it all the time. I knew that Peter's initial reluctance to accompany me into the warehouse was a sign of neither cowardice nor indifference. He was as anxious to find Patrick's killer as I was, and he's probably a lot braver than I am, but he also has a good deal more common sense than I do. We made a wide circle of the warehouse to get the lay of the land. The fortunate thing about the high windows was that while they didn't allow us to see in, they didn't allow anyone to see out either. We went around the side on the cross street, where there were 3 large docks with those towering doors that slid upward. We continued around to the back of the building and found 2 doors that I assumed to be emergency exits of some sort at either end of the building. We tried the first door and found it locked, so we went to the second and tried the knob. Fortunately for us, it was open. That must mean there's someone here, said Peter. Not necessarily, I whispered in reply. They may just be careless, after all. Who in his right mind would break into a mob warehouse? We're doing it. I looked back at him. I rest my case. With that, I turned the knob as quietly as possible, and the 2 of us passed through the door. It was not exactly cool inside, but it wasn't anywhere near as hot as it was outside. We could hear the loud, steady whir of several large fans attempting to augment the feeble air conditioning. There must be somebody here, Peter said softly. They wouldn't have left all this stuff on if the place was deserted. There aren't a lot of lights on. They probably just have a guard on duty or something. We just need to be quiet. We went along the back wall. On our left was row after row of shelving units, towering from the floor to the ceiling with an occasional cross space to provide access from aisle to aisle. We started down the last aisle, stopping now and then to check out the contents of the shelves. There were stacks and stacks of porno videos of every type imaginable, gay and straight, along with pornographic books and magazines and several other forms of paraphernalia, the likes of which I'm happy to say I'd never seen before. At one point, Peter reached into a crate and pulled out a thick rubber penis that had to be at least 10 inches long. He grimaced. A veritable pornucopia, he whispered as he replaced it. The variety of tapes was astounding, and I knew it will sound ridiculous given the tenor of our lives over the past few days. What with the porno party and the porno actors in Peter's auspicious audition, but seeing all this stuff in one place really made me feel soiled. I guess my threshold for soiling had risen way past where it should be. I made a mental note to lower it as soon as this case was over. We made our way down the aisle in the relative darkness until we reached a cross aisle that divided the first half of the warehouse from the second, sort of a porno equator. We rounded the end of it and continued along the shelves by the wall. We'd gone about half the length of the warehouse when I stopped. Did you hear that? I whispered. What? I thought I heard something. We stood there for a moment, straining to hear any sign of movement. Above the loud whoosh of the fans, I looked at Peter and shrugged, figuring it must have been my imagination, or my nerves, that had produced the sound, when suddenly we heard a faint but definite noise from the front of the warehouse. It was no more than the scraping of metal as if a chair had been pushed back or pulled out. I looked back at Peter, raising my eyebrows in question, and he nodded his assent. We quietly continued down the aisle, trying so hard to hear that my ears were beginning to pouch out. The only noise seemed to be the sound of somebody walking around and voices muted by the rushing air. The end of the aisle was partially blocked by a black wall about 8 feet tall. When we reached it, I realized it was a flat, fairly flimsy panels of plywood that stretched in a semicircle around an open area, which appeared at the end of the shelving units like a glen in the middle of an industrial metal forest. We unbacked and peeked through the open shelves. What is this? Said Peter. A set, I replied. Look. It was indeed the type of setting one sees occasionally in porn videos. A flat black room with no furnishings that adds to the anonymity in this type of room, which appears to exist in someone's warped imagination. Sexual fantasies are acted out on a platform or the floor. A card table and a couple of folding chairs were set up just inside the area. Was lit only by an overhead work light, which gave the setting the feeling of a death chamber at Dachau. "I really need a bath," said Peter. Whoever had been there wasn't there now, but we could still hear somebody in the distance, presumably down a hole beyond. "What do we do now?" Peter asked. "Wait until whoever's back there goes away, then look around." We were prepared to do just that when someone unexpectedly walked onto the set from the opposite end, closely followed by another man. The first was Derek Holmes. The second I immediately recognized as the man in the gray suit we'd seen talking to Holmes at the pretty party, while Willie Marino, this time he was dressed in a dark blue suit. I somehow thought pinstripes might be more appropriate, and was carrying a briefcase which he dropped with a slap onto the table. Marino didn't have any of Holmes's dubious heterosexuality. Instead, he emitted a threatening straightness that seemed to beckon you closer so it could strike. Though we'd originally thought that the openness of the shelves was an asset, we suddenly decided that the danger of our being spotted was too great for us to remain there. I motioned to Peter and we ducked behind the first flat. Fortunately, at the end of the first panel was a crack wide enough for us to peek through without being readily seen. "You got the money?" said Holmes. "Yes," said Marino slowly. His thumbs were resting on the twin latches to the briefcase as if poised to open it. He paused and looked up at the director. "You know, Derek," he drew Holmes's name out distastefully as if to him the director's first name was a synonym for faggot. "I've heard that you've been having a little trouble with your staff." "God," I whispered to Peter, "he sounds like Nelson." "What do you mean?" said Holmes without emotion. "You know what I mean," Marino replied gravely. Holmes replied sardonically, "I can handle anything, you know that." This reply seemed to please Marino. "We just don't like having any attention drawn, you know." Holmes' smile grew a bit more ominous. "You picked a pretty high-profile business then, haven't you?" I couldn't tell from my vantage point exactly how Marino had taken this. "I just wouldn't like to think that there are any special problems here. My business associates wouldn't like that." I got the weird feeling there was some sort of test going on here, though its exact nature eluded me given the cryptic way it was being carried out. Holmes didn't budge. He said, "Everything's taken care of." If it was a test, Holmes had passed. Marino's thumbs twitched and the latches on the briefcase popped open. I half expected the thing to explode. He turned it toward Holmes. I saw the contents just briefly. It was stuffed with money. "I think we're witnessing the big payoff," I whispered to Peter. "Then the Fed should be glad we're here to witness it," he replied softly. "We're about as impartial as they come. We'll probably have to appear at the trial." "Oh, great," I replied. "I can see it now. Faggots finger mob. We won't be alive when it comes to trial." Holmes reached into the briefcase, his usual lack of expression marred by a slightly satisfied smile. He pulled out one bundle of bills and said, "It's a living." Marino was on his way out before the words left Holmes's mouth, as if he'd already had more contact with the porn director than he wanted. I wonder if he'd head straight to the nearest Catholic church for one of those monster confessions you see in bad movies. Then again, in the movies they only go to confession when they murder someone. Holmes was thumbing through the stacks of bills when I heard a soft pong behind me, then a thud. I swung around anxiously and was about to warn Peter to be quiet when I unfortunately got a practical demonstration of what had made the sound. A pipe came down on my head. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.